Now I would like to welcome the second presenter and second speaker of the second session of today, who is Mrs. Jakubowska, and she leads the EDRI advocacy on biometric technologies such as facial recognition, and is one of the co-coordinators of the Reclaim Your Face campaign. She holds an interdisciplinary MSc in human rights with a research focus on feminist approaches to science and technology. And prior to joining EDRI, Ella worked on digital business transformation. So please welcome our second speaker. Ella, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And just double checking you can hear and see me before I jump into it.
Yes, perfectly, thanks.
Fantastic. Good day, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to talk about Reclaim Your Face, Reclaim Your Privacy, and how EDRI as a movement are using direct democracy in our work to ban biometric mass surveillance. So I work as a policy and campaigns officer at EDRI, which is a coalition of 44 different digital and human rights organizations all across Europe. And I'm also a sociologist of technology and a privacy and data protection campaigner. So Reclaim Your Face is the campaign that was launched by EDRI and initially around 22 other organizations in October of last year to campaign on the issue of biometric mass surveillance. And we're now up to actually almost 50 organizations in our coalition working across digital rights, privacy, and broader human rights as well. So first of all, I know that biometric mass surveillance is a bit of an obscure term, so I just want to set this. Thanks for letting me know. Sorry, I didn't realize that would be being shared. Thank you. So great. Now, hopefully you can see my slide about biometric data. So most people have heard of facial recognition and are aware of the rise of facial recognition in public across Europe, in everything from schools to streets to parks to uses by private companies in supermarkets and much more. But the reason that we refer to biometric data and not just facial recognition is because actually the use of each of our bodily and behavioral data is so much wider than just our faces. And it's a data protection issue because you only get one face, you only have one identity. All the things about how you move and what you look like are very personal and very individual to you. They can give away information about your health status. So for example, there's some technology that's being used that looks at the way that people walk, so the patterns of their steps, and that can actually reveal certain health conditions. Of course, your appearance can reveal things about your religion, which is a protected characteristic. It can infer things like your gender and your race. So these can be very sensitive bits of information that these technologies are trying to predict. And uses that we're seeing are everything from kind of the more well-known facial recognition through to the recognition of people's ears. We've seen the recognition of people based on the way that they sit on a chair, so the distribution of their weight on the chair. We've seen voices. We've really seen all sorts of different methods that are being used across Europe right now that are really trying to identify us constantly and threatening our privacy, our anonymity, and treating us as if we are under suspicion all of the time. So why is that a problem? Well, we call it biometric mass surveillance because it creates those conditions that every single person can be tracked and watched, and we don't necessarily know who's accessing this data. We don't necessarily know how it's going to be used against us in the future. And often what we're finding in a lot of European examples is that people don't even know that this data is being taken about them when they're just going about their daily lives. But it's capturing who you meet for a coffee with, when you go to the doctor, if you go to a protest, things like that, that actually are very sensitive. And we're not just talking about hypotheticals. Sometimes we hear people saying, well, I've got nothing to hide, or I'm not doing anything wrong, so why does this matter? And actually what we're trying to help raise awareness of is the fact that it's not about whether or not you're doing something wrong, because as we've seen in countries around the world, governments can change. And just because you trust your current government, if you suddenly end up with a Trump administration, for example, and we're seeing some similar patterns in parts of Europe, actually that data then could be used against you. And we're seeing risks to, in particular, people of color, risks to journalists and people that want to blow the whistle on political corruption and corporate corruption. So in fact, the fact that everyone, or that the potential is being created for everyone to have all of this really intrusive data collected about us all the time is something that we should be really, really concerned about. As it says on my slide, it treats us as walking barcodes, and it violates our privacy, because despite having not done anything wrong, despite there being no lawful reason for us to be considered suspicious, with the use of these technologies, every single person is treated as if we might be a suspect. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples to show that I'm not talking in the abstract. I'm talking about real cases that are happening right now in lots of different European countries. This is just a really small snapshot of the examples we're seeing, but Clearview AI, for example, that are very well known. Just I think last week or the week before, the Data Protection Authority in Hamburg said that what they were doing is illegal, that the way that they've been scraping data of all people in Europe from our online profiles without our consent is not legal, and they shouldn't be doing it. We've had Canadian data protection authorities, for example, say that it's inherently mass surveillance, what Clearview AI does, and it's illegal. And we've also just had the Swedish Data Protection Authority fine the Swedish police for how they've been using Clearview AI. So we're starting to get really strong signals that whether it's kind of private companies in collaboration with governments, or just private companies, or just governments and authorities that are doing these practices, it isn't compliant with our rights to privacy and data protection. And it can also act as a barrier to many of our other fundamental rights, because in many ways, privacy and data protection are gateway rights. So if you don't have your privacy protected, that right to anonymity, it can become much harder to express yourself, whether that's your political ideas by going to a protest, or it's your gender identity, your sexuality, your religion, or even just accessing healthcare, accessing education. And you can see that example there from France, where facial recognition was being used in high schools against children. And we were really glad to see that the French court ruled against this use, and agreed that this unchecked and really sinister rise of authorities and companies and police forces turning to facial recognition and other biometric technologies as a quick fix to actually much more complex societal problems is not the answer, and is not compliant with data protection. However, what we're finding, and we've done a lot of kind of really in-depth legal research as the EDRI network, is that the current legal framework is not giving us the full protections that we need against biometric mass surveillance. So while some data protection authorities are making some very positive decisions, and some courts are making some really great rulings, there's a grey area in the data protection legislation that we are seeing authorities and companies exploit, whether that's kind of security justifications on the kind of police side, or whether it's consent justifications on the kind of all other uses. What we're seeing is that entities or authorities and companies are trying to justify this by saying we have consent or we have a need to do this, it's necessary under law. And our legal research has shown that that just is not the case. Mass surveillance can never be justified under those principles. And so whilst we already have a general prohibition on the processing of biometric data in Europe's data protection laws, we are calling for this to be made more specific. We want the EU to have a really clear and specific law saying that biometric mass surveillance is not lawful, so that we can close this grey area, this loophole. Because right now our investigations have revealed that over half of EU countries are violating their own constitutional protections and human rights laws through the use of these technologies. So my last slide is just to let you know some exciting action that we are taking against the rise of biometric mass surveillance. So as a campaign, the Reclaim Your Face campaign launched last October, and we've been focusing on national evidence gathering, awareness raising, investigations. But as of yesterday, we launched something called a European Citizens Initiative to ban biometric mass surveillance practices in the EU. Now, we're not asking for all facial recognition technology or all biometrics to be banned. This is about the uses that can or will lead to mass surveillance. And a European Citizens Initiative is a really awesome tool because it's the only direct democratic process that the EU puts at the disposal of citizens to call for a new law. So we have made the most of this process. We've registered our call to ban biometric mass surveillance practices with the EU. And since yesterday, we opened signature collection for any EU citizens to join us by signing and calling on the EU to propose a new law to tackle this massive human rights problem. And so we launched yesterday. I think we're at about 11,000 signatures already, which is fantastic. But if we want the EU to listen to us, if we want the European Commission to formally recognise our European Citizens Initiative, we need to collect 1 million signatures in the next 12 months. So I've put the link there so that you can find our website, available in about 10 languages so far, with more coming soon. And I would really encourage you to take a look, to read through, to understand in more detail why this actually is an issue that affects every single one of us. And hopefully you'll be convinced and you will sign to give us your support and help us to reach that 1 million mark that will allow us to say to the EU, we've raised awareness, we've engaged people from across Europe, and this is a bold call to say that we do not see a place in our society for technologies of mass surveillance. So I've also put in our Twitter information, and via our website you can find out other social media. But yeah, I hope you will join us, and you will give us your support to help reclaim your face.
Thank you very much, Hella. It was very interesting to hear. And I have a few questions for you as well. So how do you see the issue of, it's definitely very highly linked to the facial recognition and then biometric mass surveillance part. How do you see the issue of deep fakes? Do you have an opinion about it? Could you elaborate a little bit more about it? Is there a way to find this battle? Is it worth fighting this battle in general?
Yeah, I think the issue of deepfakes is really important because it links to many related human rights and democratic issues like media freedom. The reasons that deepfakes can be so problematic is that already we're seeing a lot of journalists under enormous pressure, and now if we start feeling like we can't always trust the images or the videos that we're seeing because of a rise in these so-called deepfakes, or synthetic media, as we kind of prefer to call them, then it puts this whole extra burden on journalists, time burden and cost burden, to need to check, are the sources that we're receiving actually legitimate? Can we trust them? And of course, trustworthy information is a fundamental part of our societies. And then on another angle, deepfakes can be really problematic because we're seeing especially women being attacked, especially with sexual imagery. And when we already have, I think, pretty consistently across Europe, across the world, really higher barriers for women to enter the political sphere. If women are then going to be additionally targeted with these synthetic media that are trying to slander them, that are attaching sexual imagery to them, this can really disincentivize women and non-binary people from wanting to take part in public life, in democratic life. So it's very much a linked issue. I think one that is really critical that we address. I don't think necessarily we have the answers yet about the best way to tackle deepfakes, but I know that there are some incredible organizations. I would point, for example, to Witness in the US, who are doing some really good human rights-based research to look at this issue of the rise of deepfakes and what we might actually be able to do to protect our democracies and our access to information from them.
And one more very important question, really topical question, probably that related to COVID-19, right, about the pandemic. So when it comes to personal rights, to human rights, in this mass surveillance field, in this context, could COVID be seen as a way to invade privacy? Is it a possible way, of pretending that everything's all right? Would you? Well, we have seen and we have heard some opinions in the first session. So could you also elaborate on this?
Yeah, so you are absolutely correct. So of course, governments have a legitimate aim in keeping us all safe and protecting our health at this time. And for that reason, there are some exemptions to the normal data protection rules that will allow them to take extraordinary measures to protect us. And that is acceptable. But the problem that we're seeing is that there absolutely are some governments that are exploiting this to put in place mass surveillance systems that will last far beyond the pandemic. And that's not okay. That's not lawful, because we very clearly know in European law that any emergency measures must be, by definition, an emergency measure. They must be time bound. So in France, for example, that's a good case where police were using drones to try and monitor people's compliance with COVID measures. And of course, that was a legitimate aim that they were pursuing. But luckily, a court ruled that to achieve that aim, they should not have been using drones. And the reason for that is that drones are an incredibly intrusive way of policing people. It sets up the possibility that we're going to be policed in these very scary ways far after the pandemic. And so it's really important that we are holding governments to account and making sure that responses that they do take to the pandemic are time bound and are limited under law, so that they cannot exploit it in the future. But it's very much a real risk that they will try and put in place infrastructures that they can then use afterwards. And that again is why it's so important that we have initiatives like our ECI to ban biometric mass surveillance practices, because that will ensure that they cannot keep using invasive and intrusive technologies to try and control us when they no longer have a good reason to do so.
Thank you very much, Ella. It was really interesting to hear your presentation. And if anybody has any more questions to Ella, please, you can write them in the corner, and we will definitely pass them to Ella, and she will definitely be happy to reply to you.